It's strange to think that your path towards making stress work for you would start with a cold shower. But that immediate response to the cold water is actually a very beneficial experience. Welcome to the Just Dumb Enough podcast, a show that acknowledges no one is always an expert by dispelling misconceptions with real experts. I'm your host as always, Colton Petrie. My guest today is Matt Soule. Matt is so many things, but one of his most interesting careers is as a trainer of the Wim Hof method. You've probably seen videos of these people running around what looks like the Arctic in nothing but their underwear, jumping into below freezing water like it doesn't bother them. I don't know about you, but that sounds incredibly stressful to me. Yet, if you ask Matt, it's easily one of the best things you could ever do to get your mind into a much better place. Let's get cold. Welcome to the show, Matt Soule.
Colton, thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Well, certainly. So my name is Matt Soule. I'm an author, speaker, and professional instructor focusing on specifically leveraging the key pathways of stress to live our best lives. You know, really my journey, Colton, began with exposure in my childhood to some domestic violence. And really that was the initial spark that motivated me to seek out methods to combat stress. And this eventually, led to me running a martial arts school, which I do today, focusing on survival self-defense, looking to empower others to stay safe. And it's a wonderful positive stress. We can get into that in just a little bit. And later on, I kept searching for these different parts that I found were necessary to really manage all types of stress. And one of those things happened to be eventually leading me to be a Wim Hof method level 3 trainer. So this is a combination of, leading people into really freezing cold settings. Just got back from Alaska, in fact, not that long ago, where I take groups into the wilderness, have them get into the freezing rivers and lakes. We cut holes in the ice, dip in there for a couple of minutes, walk for miles and just shorts, braving the cold and really just having a good time around that. Some of the other dimensions within this type of practice specifically focus on mindset, how important mindset is as we show up to stress. And finally, the third part, specifically about the Wim Hof method, is breathing exercises. And so one of the things that's interesting about the breath is, I always talk about this, that the breath is the start and the finish of stress, right? It's the beginning and the end. We breathe close to 20,000 times a day, plus or minus. And if we can learn to manage our breath and to guide it in specific ways, this is one of the best ways to harness positive stress and manage, all sorts of stress along the continuum. And so that's really my focus, are those primary disciplines there. And, as I went throughout my journey, I really was looking for what are the root stressors. And over the course of discovery, I really came up with 5 that were central, and everything else was sort of a blossom out of that. I'll give you an example. Most of us, when we think of stress, think about things that are mentally distressing. Gosh, I got bills to pay this month. Or, the kids they're wild this morning. You give me a really hard time. I can't take it. Or, some of the other really difficult things are like a job loss. People really struggle with that. Those are huge stressors. And I don't want to deny those stressors. Those things are certainly important. But when we're looking about how to leverage stress in order to have that cross adaptation to deal with those circumstances better, what's the underlying things that really cost us? And if we look at that, I identified there's fasting, and that really is in combination with food. So that's one of the base stressors. There's the typical thing that we think of in sort of a higher extreme stress, which is fight or flight responses. And on the farthest end of that continuum, sometimes We have that nervous system freeze where we freeze up, in a stressful situation where we're immobile. We've got another one, which is relationships. And this is relationships of really any kind. It could be with, coworkers, family, whomever. But really, if we're talking about specific circuitry in the body, we can narrow it down a lot to our intimate relationships and sort of the outgrowths of that. And the last one is temperature. And what I mean by that is hot and cold. And if we look at that from the breath through all of the rest of those four, I started to realize, okay, we can pretty much dive into each of these because they've got a physical, a mental, and emotional component. And that means we can reframe the baseline of how we show up to that stress and ultimately have clear ideas about how to train it. And I found, okay, this is how we leverage stress. This is where it's at.
Yeah.
And I've been doing this for about 15 years now and seeing some pretty fantastic results with people.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very interesting. It's one of those that people would think like, oh, well, there's stress. Like it just exists as one word and that's all it is. And you're like, no, there's a bunch of stresses and they can overlap. And they're like, oh, that sounds worse. I think it just got worse.
Well, we have to recognize that stress can be cumulative. I think that's one thing that people don't fully understand necessarily is the cumulative nature of stress. As we start stacking things together, how they can be really pretty serious in terms of breaking our mental state, our physical body down over time. But then there's the positive side of stacking and bringing stressors together in order to make it so that our baseline reaction to stress is much lower. And you see that across the board, especially with people in sort of high stress jobs, that really learn to manage it. I'll take just a really common example that I think everybody could quickly understand is somebody like a Navy SEAL versus somebody that's barely trained in terms of entering a police force for the first time. Maybe they've only had 6 months in the academy, new police officer, lots of challenges there, especially as they have to encounter extreme stress like drawing a weapon versus somebody that's really highly trained in that modality. Gosh, those guys show up and they're just action mode, right? That's a really big difference. And I feel like most of us without training are like that rookie police officer, but just in life. There's really specific tools that we can use in our busy lives that will allow us to get to that Navy SEAL operation with a lot less effort than I think people realize.
So, I mean, where do you start? Because obviously it sounds super cool to be like, I'm going to go, out into the Arctic and jump into freezing cold water, but you're like, you can't just start there, right?
No. Right.
So where do you start?
Yeah, so I think we can divide this into sort of two camps that's going to be helpful for the audience. And one of the places is figure out what are your end goals with this? Is it just to elevate your mood a little bit and start to form a baseline? One of the simplest ways is you can start with turning the shower to the cold setting, and just make it uncomfortably cold. You don't have to spin the dial completely, but you're going to start turning that down. But here's the caveat. It's not just the cold, right? You've got to be able to train the nervous system to show up differently with that stressor. Because if you just went into the shower, you've never done this before, and you flipped it cold, you get this big cold shock response. Your shoulders would go up. You breathe fast. You fight it like crazy. I know because I've seen a lot of people do it, and frankly, I did it. Right? The first time I read that I needed to take a cold shower, this is over a decade ago, reading this book by Wim Hof, and it's not terribly instructive. And I was like, all right, I'm going to do this thing. And I get in, and I was just gritting it for like a minute. I was like, this is worthless. Turn it off. Like, what am I doing? Right. And so we don't want to go about it like that. That's not going to help us in terms of how we show up to stress. What we're thinking of instead is as we turn that dial, we're going to get that response, but then we want to steer to calm amidst the stress. And the way to do that is, obviously having a good mindset around it. But the physical thing is simply through the breath, just concentrating on long exhales. And the great thing is that your body adapts. We've got so much just sort of badass machinery in our systems that knows what to do. We just often need to get out of our own way and have these simple little tools that allow us to show up the best. in those scenarios. And so you're just retraining. And over time, you do that for a couple of weeks, and your body all of a sudden optimizes in a way that's very different than that starting. All of a sudden, when you turn that on, the cold shock and gasp response is not nearly as substantial. You're easily able to control your breath much earlier. You don't fight it as much in your brain, right? We always have the internal voice. There's an internal voice that says, not today, or you don't need to do that, or take it easy, that sort of thing. Or why would I want to do that? This is miserable. Could be a voice that's inside of there. I get it. Yeah, we all have that. But the idea is that if you can just get past that part and just move to action, you start to get this new response. And it really becomes a mirror for us. A mirror. How do you show up in a stressful situation? And so all of a sudden that phone call that you get, it tells you you've got an impromptu presentation at work that you've got to handle. Or you've got somebody, the kids are going crazy, whatever it is that used to just really put you over the edge in the morning when you're trying to get everything ready to get out the door, whatever it might be. All of a sudden, there's less reaction and far more response, right? Deliberate response. I've got that pause, that moment where I go, all right, I can deal with this. Let's go. And you can orient toward the next thing. And so if you train these 5 different stressors, as I mentioned, these root stressors, it pretty much covers the whole gamut, right? It covers across the board because there's a ton of cross adaptation for many of them. But there's, I would argue, sort of the whole adaptation, cross adaptation, if you cover all 5, right? So that's really the key. So how to get started? Cold in the shower is an easy one, Start a breath practice, something super simple, something that you can do at no cost that takes you 5 minutes. Most of us are quite busy in the mornings. We really struggle with adding new routines. Now, I'll tell you a quick story. Last fall, I was doing a project where I had to walk for, I think it was 20 minutes every day with a rucksack. Coleman, are you familiar with the ruck material?
Yeah, it's like a big military kind of pack, right?
Exactly. Yep. It's just basically a chest vest and, you stick weight in it and you just go for a walk. Some people have a backpack. That's another version. At one point, I even had to do it with food cans because I was traveling and still trying to adapt. Well, the commitment in this particular thing was 30 days. 30 days, just 20 minutes a day. Gosh, how often do we say, anybody can do 20 minutes, it's no big deal. But when you ask yourself to do something that's outside of the typical routine and you want to do it every day, man, it's challenging. I found a number of challenges. I had to get my daughter involved just so I could, make sure I'm spending the proper time with her and not avoiding those things, and just engaging her in a number of different ways. I was traveling because I travel almost every month. All over. So I was like, how am I going to ship all of this extra weight in my suitcases? I didn't have room for it. So I'm like doing the makeshift thing partway through. As I mentioned, I'm stuffing food cans, borrowing cans of food to put in a backpack so that I can walk with this weight and do my mile. And it's like, it reminded me just how much 20 minutes a day can seem or be a lot. So my advice, if you want to get started, start really small and figure out where you can insert these things to build habits that are going to benefit you in a positive way. And so my favorite habit stack, I like to put things together, stacking habits together because it's easier. I pick something like my coffee in the morning. I know I'm going to make coffee. I don't have to think about making coffee. As soon as I get out of bed, I'm already ready to do the ritual. So I go in, I put the coffee on, and during that time, I do 10 minutes of breathing exercises. And it's remarkable. It wakes me up in the morning. It starts my digestion. It puts me into the specific exercises I do call them are a way to induce stress through the breath and then recover through a breath hold. So I do these little cycles that train my system to rapidly adapt. Stress, rest, stress, rest, stress, rest. And by doing that, anytime I do meet a stressor, I can get out quicker. And I can rise to the occasion faster. It's been a number of things that are beneficial around it. But more importantly, it takes me 10 minutes. And I do it while my coffee's cooking. I get done, I go about the day. And so finding those little moments, I think, are some of the best places to start.
Well, and this certainly seems like something you could, artificially add a lot more stress to the situation because you're like, oh, well, they said cold shower, so I just spun the cold knob. Like, and it's really hard to deal with. And you're like, this sucks. I want to quit. I don't want to do this. Where you're like, just take your normal shower and turn it down 3 degrees. Like, that's not so hard. So, the same thing, like, oh, I've got to do this hike for, 20 minutes that I've got to like push through. And somebody's like, well, I'll just do an hour. And if I do an hour every day, 20 minutes isn't so bad. And you're like, 20 minutes is hard enough. Like, you don't have to make this worse for yourself.
That's right. It's all about consistency, and it's so hard. A lot of times, if we don't have a particular routine, and we'll just take a typical exercise routine, since we're about March and most people at this point have started to fall off with their New Year's resolutions, right? Everybody was gung-ho at the beginning and now struggling to maintain it. Well, part of the reason that's the case really speaks to we bite off way more than we can chew at the beginning, right? So at the beginning, we say, all right, I'm not used to really doing much exercise. Maybe I go once in a while, but now I'm going to be in the routine 5 to 7 days a week. And I'm going to make sure I'm in the gym for at least an hour. Man, that's too much, right? It overloads the system. It's unreasonable. It's difficult to make it work in your life. If we can instead insert these things where we go, all right, I'm going to build up gradually, or however that looks. You mentioned 3 degrees less in the shower. All right, so make that a concentration. Turn it a quarter dial for the next, 2 weeks or 3 weeks every time you get in the shower, just for 20 seconds. It doesn't need to be for a long time. You'll get there pretty fast. And one of the unique things about positive stressors, specifically the ones that I mentioned, is because of how they operate in the body and brain, they're actually self-reinforcing because they feel good. They release endorphins, right? They raise adrenaline. So you get elevated mood a lot of times. They reset tons of hormones in the body. So you walk away, you're like, oh, okay, well, that was hard at the beginning, right? Before I actually went through the path. But now that I'm on the other side of it, yeah, it might feel pretty good. And so you do that enough times and it can help, it can help encourage the motivation. We just need to get to that point where we build it as routine. And so set the bar much lower than you think you should and start digging in consistently. And I think you're going to see the results.
It's one of those that's like, even if it feels goofy to only do something for 3 minutes or for 20 seconds, you're like, well, what help is this going to be? You're like, you're just barely getting into it. You're dipping a toe. You don't have to jump all the way and you just have to start because that like the will to start is going to drive you much further, it seems.
For sure. Yeah. And we can almost trick ourselves as well. Because once we get into the mix, sometimes it's actually not that bad. But like we get through that initial resistance and hard part, and then we're like, oh, is this all it is? Okay, I can stay here for a bit. And you might find that it's a lot longer than you anticipated, but set the bar lower for yourself, Just say, I'm going to get in today. I'm going to do this action today. I'm going to do 1 round of breathing exercises. I'm just going to concentrate on, inhaling twice through the nose and extending through the mouth. I'm going to do that for 1 minute. That's all I'm going to do every day. Great. Set an alarm. See what happens. It's remarkable. It's like these little things start aggregating to this point where, gosh, all right, what else? You start to want to investigate more. It's easier to add more things. You start to get curious about your practice. That's where it's at. Get yourself to start.
For sure. I mean, it sounds like both the breath work and like that mental readiness for stress have been, 2 extremely beneficial things for you. Do you think they're like the best things that have come out of what you've learned so far?
I would say that the breath is probably the most important thing, and partly because it's free. I can practice it anywhere, anytime. I don't need a training partner. I don't need a specific place to do it per se. Like I can do a lot. And what's kind of wild is the capacity of what the breath can do. I can't recall what doctor said it, but the breath will even take us to a psychedelic space. And the doctor I'm referring to, I apologize, can't remember his name, but he had mentioned that a psychedelic state is basically like an ultimate stressor. right? It's like a huge stress in the brain that happens and producing this psychedelic experience. Well, the breath can take us there. The breath can take you to this beautiful space where you can tap into emotions, psychedelic experiences, and return. It can take you to where you can just be super calm in the midst of an extreme stress situation. It can be something that can bond us together and connect human beings profoundly, just breathing together for a few minutes. I've seen just remarkable results of even small groups of just a couple of people producing this wildly big response through group breathing. And I've also seen as many, I was on tour with Wim Hof all over the world, and we had groups as big as 1,200 breathing together. Now, that's a wild experience, man. It just blows your socks off, right? So you can see the breath, I would say, is the biggest point of leverage that's possible. And because we do it so often and so much, it has the most impact as well. The vast majority of people have a disrupted breathing pattern. And almost all of us are subject to this. I was an athlete my whole life. I grew up as an athlete. I played high-level sports. I continued on in an athletic type endeavors. I went into martial arts and in other parts. I do a lot of, leading people into the woods, altitude climbs, all kinds of stuff. So I was quite familiar with the breath from an early stage, but I couldn't believe that I was even subject to a lot of these disrupted breathing patterns before I had that recognition and understanding. And one of the most common things is unintentional breath holds. So anytime we're learning a new thing, we tend to hold our breath unnecessarily. And that causes anxiety. It causes challenges in the body to clear and to clear metabolic waste, for example. It has trouble clearing CO2 properly. You have trouble getting proper blood flow. Your heart ends up working harder. Your vascular system starts to narrow more so that you have more pressure in the system, more higher blood pressure and so forth. All of these things chain together simply from disrupted breathing. So if we think about like the stuff that I've learned, if I said there's one thing that is the most important, it's the breath. So paying attention to that, keeping the breath going.
Certainly. I mean, do you find any of those? And I've heard a couple, and I'm sure I'm going to get them wrong, but there's like block breathing or, a 4-7-8 or whatever they're called. Is there any one of those where you're like, this is actually really good? I like this one.
That's a great question. So I think you're referring to box breathing. So box breathing simply means that you're going to breathe in for, let's just say, 4 seconds. Hold your breath for 4 seconds. Breathe out for 4 seconds. And hold your breath at the end there for 4 seconds. So it ends up looking like a box. And you can pick any number of seconds. There's just even breath in, hold your breath at the top, breath out, hold your breath at the bottom, breathe in, so on and so forth. So that's box breathing, and that's often taught to our military. I've worked with a lot of military guys over the years here, and they said that was what was given to us. That was pretty much the extent of our breath training, but that was a big one. And it's a wonderful method. And it's a very easy thing for people to try and understand. So great. I think that's an excellent one. I like coherence breathing. Coherence breathing simply means you take 1 to 2 minutes and you focus on even exhales and inhales, and you try to go to the full range of your breath without force. So that could look like, 5 to 6 seconds of an inhale and 5 to 6 seconds of an exhale. So they're even. That's why we call it coherence. That's a wonderful exercise. And you can do it in any setting, anytime. And like I said, if you take 1 to 2 minutes, you will entirely change your state. That's powerful. There's not a lot of stuff that you can do a full state change, like mental state, body state change in a 1 to 2 minute exercise. So coherence is an excellent one that I like, that's easy for your listeners to wrap around. Now you had mentioned, I'll just mention one more before you dive in here, which is like a 4-8. And let's talk about just for a moment so your listeners understand how powerful understanding just some parts of our breath are. So a 4-8 or a 4-7 or some of these different combinations refers to 4 seconds of an inhale and about 7 or 8 seconds as an exhale. Now, why is that so powerful? Well, every inhale stimulates an action-oriented response. And you can picture this like on more of an extreme end just for a moment, though it doesn't have to be extreme. Imagine that we're walking together in the mountains and we're just enjoying each other's company and just talking, having a good time. And all of a sudden you see a snake in the grass. We're going to gasp in and we're going to hold our breath for a moment. And in that moment, we stimulate this big action-oriented response. The liver starts producing more glucose to give us more energy. Our lungs start to dilate. That's what that inhale is about. And we start to be able to, our heart rate speeds up. All these actions start to happen on more the extreme end. But even on the microcurve, meaning each breath cycle, that breath in stimulates a more action-oriented response. Now, every breath out stimulates the rest response. So just on the other side, where we get that feeling if we see a snake, what do we feel like when we're done with a big job? Right? We get this big sigh. That's the relaxation trigger. So that's sort of on the bigger thing, right? The big sigh is more the extreme side of that rest response. But on the individual breath cycle, simply an out breath stimulates that more resting response. And so if you want to steer your nervous system in your stress state, having that sort of idea of understanding, okay, well, if I'm breathing in and holding, I'm stimulating a much more action-oriented response in that. If I'm breathing out and relaxed, I'm stimulating a more rest thing. And so when we get to like the 4 sevens, you're just encouraging the system, hey, rest, you're good, you're calm. Right? So that's the idea behind it.
Nice. Well, I mean, you said, doing breathing exercises, number one, great, but also doing them with these colossal groups. Like that must be really something to experience because there is something about like that group psychology where you're like, hey, we're all in this together. I better not be, the one not participating or the one backing out first or whatever it is.
Yeah. Prior to the Wim Hof method, I'd never done like true group breathing. I'd done some yoga stuff, some qigong where you're doing exercises in a group, but I would not say that that's the same thing as what I'm referring to as group breathing. The group breathing that I'm referring to is where everybody is going through like more or less inducing a stress state. So you're breathing way more than you normally would otherwise for a particular time. And different methods have different protocols that are associated with it. So I'll just speak to the one that I typically guide people through specifically for the Wim Hof method. But you do a series of deep breaths, over and over and over, usually about 30 to 40 or so for one of the basic protocols. And then you steer into a breath hold, which allows us to relax, but also at the end of that breath hold, starts to amplify the experience. And you do that a few times in this group setting where everybody's breathing together and going through this process. It is wild. If you've not experienced it, it is definitely worth experiencing because people laugh, they cry, they feel super energized, like just wild stuff, and all are okay. Like not everybody has these extreme symptoms. Everybody has their own experience, but the sensations that people experience together, regardless, even as you get into this group setting, is profound. And I think it's pretty cool.
Well, and, looking at, what we just did, which is the best kind of easiest or most beneficial stuff, is there one on the other side where you're like, either this is the hardest thing to implement for people in general, or like it's so hard to learn just because it requires so much practice?
Okay, fair. So there's two things there. I would say martial arts, depending on the type of martial art, can be one of those things. Martial arts can be scary for people that have never tried, that discipline, any of the specific disciplines within martial arts. If you have a combative element like sparring, where you're regularly having to go against people and even do competition within, a class setting. So it's not, elevated to competition like you're competing for a trophy, but even competing within class can be challenging. There's an element within martial arts that is very unique and separate from almost any other athletic endeavor that exists. And that is coming to terms with self and other harm. And so you're literally practicing that. Right? So anything else, like even dance that has like crazy lifts where harm might happen as a result, it's unintentional, right? In martial arts, often it's not like I'm intending to harm this person, but I am to a point. right? The idea is that I've got enough control that I do it before I leave any kind of lasting injury. That's a very different thing. But the intent at its most basic form is to harm another person. And yet this translates to one of the most peaceful things that comes out of it. You build really deep bonds of trust with each other. You end up being more relaxed. You understand what's possible and what's not if you've got a quality martial art that you're practicing where you're really pushing these bounds. But that takes a lot of commitment, practice, and focus over an extended period to develop quality skills. And so I find that a lot of people struggle in that specific area, especially if the martial art involves a significant amount of sparring. There's a couple that I do. One is Chunjo, and it's a style of survival self-defense. So we're focused on that. But many of the exercises within that have both a cooperative and a competitive element because you need to. In order to build skill, you got to push each other. We do it to optimize safety, optimize risk. We do that, and we've got a wonderful track record of people not getting injured really badly and that sort of thing. We work together as strong bonds, and that's really good. But many striking arts, that happens to include a lot of striking, struggle in that area to do it safely. So a lot of people get brain damage in boxing, for example, or these other areas where sparring is prevalent. So that can be a challenge for folks. I'd say if you're going to go find a martial art, find one that you're willing to accept the risks of that specific discipline. Another one that I do is a style of grappling called jiu-jitsu. So Brazilian jiu-jitsu can be done in a gi, and then there's the more grappling side of it, which is no gi. I do both of them. And that's a wonderful art because the likelihood of brain damage is almost zero. You can go almost to full speed, or full speed with relative safety. I'm not saying there's no risks involved in it because there certainly are, but you can really push each other and work hard. But if you're going to go to that class, every class, there's going to be sparring, and we do it at the end of literally every class. And so it can be a big barrier for people to get over, to show up in that space. I will tell you, though, if you can get past that initial discomfort, if you can be willing to invest in understanding that you're going to lose at the beginning, right, against people that are better. If you can just be okay with that, but still rise to the occasion and get after it, it becomes positively addicting, right? Where you can't wait to go to class and get that experience. But you got to get to that point. You got to get over that initial obstacle, Colton, and it's tough. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It's tough for people.
But yeah, and you're like, I got to show up knowing I'm going to lose so that one day I can show up and not know if I'm going to lose anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's more or less true. Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, to be fair, you'll probably be with other people that are there about at your same level, and I see some guys. I'll speak to guys just for a minute, but it's for everybody really. But sometimes you'll get a guy that's got an idea like, hey, I'm a tough guy, really strong, big, I should be able to mop the floor. And then he gets just taken to school by a guy that's half his size. That can be a challenging thing to accept, to be okay with. But if you can be okay with it, man, on the other side, it's a beautiful thing. You just got to invest in a lot of the discomfort and looking at how failure shows up as part of the model of success. And that's a mirror in so many places. That's a mirror in entrepreneurship. That's a mirror in many aspects of life. And it is exemplified in martial arts, a good martial art that can teach you how to lose and gracefully, and where technique is really, if you've got really solid technique, it is superior to size and strength. That doesn't happen very often.
No, it really reminds me of hearing somebody say the phrase like fail forward, because they're like, look, you're going to fail. That's how this works. Like, you got to fail to learn, but you can at least do it, for yourself. You're like, I'm going to lean into it, try and get as much out of it as I can, go home, reflect, come back, do it again.
I think that's exactly right. And if we talk about it and kind of pull it back to the stress side of things, how many of us struggle to show up in even just potential conflict with people in a relatively safe setting, right? A lot of us, we avoid conflict like crazy. We don't say what we really think or need. to somebody for all kinds of different fears and worries. And practicing something like this, where we're used to failing, we're used to showing up, in a hard space and having challenges, we understand conflict in a whole different realm. And now all of a sudden, the ease at which we can show up to those other stressful environments, it makes it a lot nicer. It makes it a lot more, oh, this isn't so bad. Yeah, I could tell this person, honestly what I think. Of course, we should have compassion for people and not just be super blunt. I'm not suggesting, training martial arts, you're going to tell everybody to go to hell. It's not like that at all, but speaking your mind and not fearing some of that conflict, knowing that you're capable. Gosh, man, how wonderful. And if failure is part of that model to get there, sign me up. We can get to that space. It's a powerful space to recognize the benefits of not just the physical pursuit, which is many, but also this other mental and emotional component that translates to so many areas in life where we need it.
Well, and we're talking about stress and some of these things that are very hard to overcome. Is there a stress that you think people experience out there that you're like, this one's the worst? Like, it has very little that you can gain from it, and it's just hard. Like, you don't want to experience it. You want to avoid it as much as possible just because it's so bad.
Oh man, that's a great question. Is there I mean, in some ways, this is going to be individual, right? And this kind of speaks to individual fears. I think the Toastmasters, which runs public speaking, for example, will often cite that public speaking is people's number one fear, sometimes above the fear of death. Where you go, oh my gosh, but can that one be leveraged? Yeah, so I think even our worst fears, our worst stressors, still can show up as positive things. I think individually, though, some are worse than others. And, that if we divide stress into stress we can choose and stress we can't choose, I think it's a good starting point. And if you pick enough good stressors that you can choose to do in your life, the things like, quality physical exercise. And I like martial arts because it's like a habit stack. I get my great physical exercise, but I also get some of these other mental and emotional benefits that we talked about earlier. But if you can do some of these positive stressors, then you show up to that stuff that you didn't choose, the stuff that you'd otherwise rather avoid. And it's all right. It's not so bad anymore, or you're able to navigate that situation much more clearly.
It's about building a ratio where you're like, if 5 of the things I'm doing today are good and one of them's bad, like I'm still positive 4. Let's keep moving.
That's right. And, everybody's different in terms of what their base tolerance is, but we all have the capacity to raise that base tolerance. One of the things that I would caution people for, though, is not to overdo even those sort of positive stressors. So I'll give you a thing I'm really referring to right now, for example, is a lot of people are gung-ho on getting into ice baths. And if you'd ask me, is ice baths, are those a good idea? I'd say, hell yeah, they're a great idea, right? They're a lot of fun. They can be pretty extreme cold. Ice bath is pretty cold if it's significant ice and so forth. It might drop the temperature down into the 30s. That's a cold bath. But we don't need to overdo that kind of thing. The more extreme your stressor, the less time you need to do it, right? The dose needs to be small in order for it to be beneficial, or else one or two things is going to happen. One thing that could happen is you could get injured or worse, right? We don't want injury or something even lasting down the line to happen, or some people could have induced heart attack or something like that if you really went far. So we don't want that to happen from a positive potential stressor. And we also don't want to create a sympathetic tone that steers us into being like in this elevated state all the time. So sympathetic just means action oriented, right? So we've got these sympathetic nerves running throughout our body. It's part of our nervous system. And we've got parasympathetic nerves that run throughout our nervous system. And the sympathetic are the action oriented, and the parasympathetic are the much more rest and recovery oriented. And sometimes people divide those two things and think they're separate and either on or off or, that kind of thing. And really they're happening and innervating every moment of every day, all the time. But we can have our system steer more dominant toward one or the other. And people that are taking really significant stressors and overdoing it, you can start to steer into a sympathetic tone where it's tough to get out of that stress, and you'll be having trouble sleeping, you feel agitated, you get all that other side. And you took a really positive thing that's potentially to pull you out of all those other stuff. And sometimes we can do too much. So people can do too much or get injured. So I just say, if your audience is listening and you're doing ice baths already, take it easy. I've been doing this for a long time. My daily routine, I never really go in more than 2 minutes for 9 months out of the year. And then whenever I want to take people into nature or do extended times, I've got a seasonal training regimen that I use in order to push myself in that. But that way I'm not always on the knife's edge of trying to train to my, push my body to its absolute limit. But it's enough consistency that if I want to go to Alaska, as I mentioned, and take people into freezing waters and to go hang out and get into the cold, I could do it at a drop of a hat. This last year, Colin, we took a group into Alaska there, and it was negative 27 Fahrenheit on our coldest day. Now, we've been doing this annual trip for quite a while, and this is by far the coldest we've ever led people into this area. So it is extreme. It's extreme. And we had people that were pretty new to the practice of getting into cold water. So we wanted to make sure we tailor everything, keep it safe, make sure people have a great time as they do it. And so we started off really small. We're out there, leading people. We often will set up saunas on site in order to have like an added buffer and also to allow us to be in there for an extended period. In these trips, we always have at least one cold exposure where you don't have sauna so that you get the experience of your body doing all of the work to heat up. And that's a very positive thing. But in this particular setting, it's so cold. We wanted to make sure we put saunas on site the whole time. But we let people, play in this environment, guiding them safely. But we kept the exposure super short, like 1 minute at the beginning on day one. So everybody gets acclimated to this. And what's so powerful about our nervous systems and our bodies and the millions of genes that we have, or millions of years of evolution that we have in our genes, is that the body will adapt super fast if you give it these small little doses and you don't overdo it. If you get to recover from it each time, that's what makes a stress positive. It's that you get the stressor, but it's in a dose sufficient that you get the recovery. That's the flip side of the coin. And so we put these guys in for just a minute on the first day, and they went through that routine, a couple of times. At first, when we brought everybody out and showed them the temperature, I think on that first day it was only like -9 or something insane, right? So first day they go in for a minute and everyone's like, I'm only going to do one exposure was the thought. I surveyed our whole group and everyone's like, there's no way I'm going in a second time. But once you get out there, you dip, you get out, you realize that your body's got the capacity to handle it. Everybody went for multiple dips, right? So everybody did at least 2 or 3 dips that day. By the last day, when it was negative 27, we had guys literally jogging a quarter mile, all the way down in bare feet in the snow, jumping off of a bridge into 35-degree river water, rolling in the snow and laughing their asses off. How powerful, man. Just playing because they took it in the proper steps and learn the specific techniques of how to heat up, how to maintain emotional calm in the midst of the stress, all those little micro skills that translate to a big deal. And they go home happy, right? And that's really what these kind of stressors are designed for. Keep it good, keep it happy, and then you can even push it to extremes in short periods and get positive benefit.
Well, and if you're ready for some of those extremes, you can say phrases like only -9 degrees.
Right. It's insane. To be fair, like the vast majority of our trips, we've gotten lucky, I would say, over the last few years. But in the last 3 years, I think that was 50 degrees colder than what we've had mostly experienced. Because usually it's about 20, 25 degrees. You start getting to -7. I mean, that's pretty brutal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people are able to go through this. It shows like the flexibility, the amount of like bend that we have really that we can handle, because otherwise you have people that are like the gap between willing to go on those trips for fun and people that are working the 9 to 5 and they're like, I am overstressed.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you. So the groups that come to these things might surprise you. They are the 9 to 5 overstressed and the adventurous types. We get both. We really get both. And that's what's so interesting to me. Our age range, I think our oldest guy on this most recent trip was like 63, if I'm not mistaken. So not a terribly young guy. Had fairly limited experience with the cold. He just started. He had attended his first cold experience workshop, I think in August or September of the previous year. So he trained for about 4 to 6 months, and was pretty regular with it. Had a blast. Just crushed it. Like our bodies they're pretty resilient. We just have to make sure that we're showing up in the space with a small enough dose that the body knows how to adapt. One of the things that happens in stress, and this is across the board, is the body. We all have the machinery to show up to a stressor, from everything from a mild stress to an extreme stress. The question is how accurate is the response? It's just for some of us in sort of that middle range or a high stressor might look like an extreme response in the body. And having just a few techniques that you can anchor around levels that out, right? Levels that out. So I think when we started this conversation, I was mentioning, kind of comparing a rookie police officer to a Navy SEAL. Somebody's got a substantial amount of training versus somebody that just graduated from the police academy for the first time and is finding themselves on the street. That's a big difference. Now, a Navy SEAL takes a lot of training, many, many years, right? That's a really refined thing. And I'd almost make an analogy of the martial arts training. You ask me, what's the hardest one for people to stick with? I would say some of the martial arts, because it takes a lot of training over an extended period. But thermogenic training, cold training, actually takes a lot less for people to adapt. Right? They show up very quickly and can adapt if you bite-size the pieces, and they've got the techniques where they don't have a really negative response at the beginning. Because if you've got a negative response at the beginning and you don't handle the emotions and you're really breathing fast and you're not sure how to do it and you're locking up, it can cause a really negative experience to the point where you don't adapt that fast. You really struggle, right? And that's why guidance and a little bit of a step-by-step care really makes a difference. If you go with somebody that's got the understanding of the nervous system and the body to guide you through this kind of thing, man, you can learn to practice fast. Whereas opposed to people that maybe just do this on their own for the first time, may not understand the full benefits and make some early mistakes. And it might take a lot longer to learn how to adapt within that setting. So that being said, like just to illustrate a quick example, a few years ago, we had this guy that came on our trip. He had never done any cold water immersion, zero. And he shows up to Alaska for the first time. First time. Now, this guy, he's probably, I bet he's 40 years old. So he's not a super young guy. He's also not an old guy. He's just, about like me. I'm 45 at this point, but 40 years old. He's in decent shape, but had never done any cold. Well, the first day when he got into the cold water, man, he went just to his waist and just for about a minute. And that was it. Single exposure to the waist, and that was substantial. And he was like, wow, okay, that was really, really hard. But we kept working, talked about some of the other techniques, worked on some of the breath stuff that goes along with it. Day 2, he was able to submerge inside of an ice hole, and the ice cold that we had to cut was 18 inches deep. I mean, it was very, very thick ice. Just to give your audience a reference, I think it's on 4 inches of ice, you can drive a truck. So right, 18, I mean, this is a brutal, right? It was cold. A couple of weeks prior to leading up to the workshop, we got pretty good weather. I think it was like 25 that week or so. But just prior, it had been really brutal cold. So it is frozen a lot. But so he was able to submerge on day 2. Day 3, he's back flipping into a waterfall, a frozen area waterfall with a pool at the end. Like he's just playing like a polar bear. This is what happens. 3 days, never had done it. But because he was bite-sized, he could even play in that extreme environment. So I just encourage people, like, take your time, be patient. If you've got good guidance, you might be able to go fast in a retreat type setting. If you're not in that, start in the shower. Super easy, the quarter dial, and just see how it feels. Feels nice. It feels nice. Feels
Yeah.
nice.
I love it. And it's like, like you said, we're super adaptable as creatures. It almost makes me want to see if people are living, like you said, on that knife's edge. Sometimes they're so highly stressed that they're just used to living there, and their body is almost kind of adapted, or their mindset at least is just like, this is my life. Every day I am, all the way at 100, and there is no way to like get out of this. This is just what my normal life is. Is there a way to like snap those people back to say like, hey, this is not normal. You can make it out of this?
Yeah. So I call that stress recoil, where the stress continues. And the best way, there's two ways. One, use a high enough threshold stressor, a survival stress. So a lot of what I've been talking about, my 5 root stressors, I call them survival stress tools because they are at the highest thresholds of stress. If you get into 32-degree water, 33, that's survival stress, right? And that lasts really up to about 45 degrees in terms of what it does to the body as the body marshals all of its resources to show up to that situation. Sparring in martial arts, that's a survival stress, right? It's the highest threshold that you can experience as you fight, as you're trying to defend somebody choking you or something like that. That's the highest level. So if you take these guys that are at that top and you put them in a survival situation and give them the tools, it'll actually pull them out. At the end, you'll be, I finally rested. And then the goal is to have the body develop better adaptability between the stress and the rest states, because most of the people that are going at that 100 mark, they need to be there or want to be there for their own personal aspirations and goals. I don't want to take high performers out of that situation. People that want to tune that up, do it. The question is when you need the off switch, can you do it like a switch? And the vast majority of us cannot. We don't have the switch off. We got the switch on, but it gets to the point where we have to get sick before we can have an off switch. Well, that's not what we want. We don't want to get sick. We're coming down with a cold, or we're laid out for a week or two in bed because the body just says, enough, you can't adapt anymore. And it's exhausted. Or, we have some other health implication, heart disease or a heart attack or something like that. That's terrible too. It's the same kind of deal. It's like elevated for too long without the off switch. So to get the off switch, get a higher threshold stress tool for a short period that'll pull you out. That's one. And over time, use the breath to learn how to adapt back and forth faster and better. Now, that could be breathing exercises that induce stress and then relax right afterward. It's probably the most powerful thing you can do to train the body.
I mean, I think that's excellent. Everything, honestly, you've shared today is so good that I hope people are like taking notes, willing to listen to this a second time, because this has been awesome. And thank you so much for being on the show. I want to make sure people can find more from you if they're looking to find more.
Fantastic. Best way to find me is you can go to stressparadox.com, and that'll steer you into my personal websites. It's all my social media stuff. That way you're not trying to spell my last name or something along those lines. Stressparadox.com will lead you to all the good stuff. You can find me there.
Fantastic. And I will put that in the show notes. So if everybody just drops the description down, there will be a link. You can just click on it. Super easy. You don't have to worry about any of your spelling at all. But Matt, thank you so much for being here. This has been so awesome. You're so fun.
Holden, I really appreciate it. I love the opportunity. It was great to speak with you today.
Yeah, it was great. I appreciate your time immensely. Thank you again.
Have a good one.
It's really striking how too much of a good thing causes us to embrace way more stress than necessary. So I'm going to challenge people in a bit of a different direction this time. Do 5 minutes less exercise. If you're already doing 0, you know you need to change. But if you're doing an hour, do 5 minutes less. I'm challenging you to stop early. Then maybe tomorrow you realize you feel better because you didn't overdo it so much. Find a happy medium between doing the most you can do and not doing any at all. This is the first day of April, so the rankings are a little unusual. Number 1, the United States, led by Colorado, New Mexico, and Louisiana. Number 2, Australia, with Victoria at an early lead. Number 3, England of the UK. Number 4, Ghana, welcome to the top 5. And number 5, Canada, with Quebec out front. Those will probably shift and change a bit over the first week, and I'm excited to see how it works out. That's it for this week. Have a great week, a great weekend, and I'll see you all back here for another new episode next week. Until the next episode, please do all those things that help the show grow, like rating, reviewing, liking, and subscribing. Remember, you can reach out to dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social medias if you want to reach me personally. But most importantly, stay dumb.